They laughed, cigarettes dangling, eyes crinkling with contempt beneath leather helmets. The P-51 Mustang was nothing to fear, a toy against their superior Messerschmitts. Wilhelm Schmidt had downed 15 Allied aircraft, his comrades dozens more. That morning, as frost coated the runways of occupied France, they joked about American tin cans. Or, by sunset, 3 of their planes would spiral into flames, black smoke trailing like signatures, while a single P-51 Mustang, piloted by a farm boy from Nebraska, would return home. Subscribe now to witness how overconfidence bleeds into the clouds. The briefing room at Luftwaffe Air Base Abbeville hummed with confidence on that February morning in 1944. Cigarette smoke hung in layered veils beneath the low ceiling, mixing with the scent of coffee and leather flight jackets worn thin at the elbows. Hauptmann Karl Weber, 37 kills to his name, tapped ash onto a map of the English Channel, while his fellow pilots leaned in, their faces etched with the peculiar calm that comes only to those who have faced death and survived it repeatedly. Outside, the German fighters stood in perfect formation, frost glittering on their wings like crushed diamonds, engines silent but promising thunder when awoken. The Americans are sending their P-51s again today, Weber announced, his voice carrying a dismissive edge that drew knowing smiles from the assembled pilots. These Mustangs they're so proud of. His finger traced the expected flight path of the American bombers they were meant to intercept, but it was the escort fighters that had become the subject of their morning amusement. The bitter wind rattled the windows of the briefing room, a counterpoint to the warm laughter that followed Weber's mocking imitation of the P-51's engine sound. Maps fluttered as the door opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the distant sound of mechanics working on the Messerschmitt engines. Among the pilots, Otto Müller took a long draw from his cigarette, exhaling slowly as he studied the intelligence photographs of the American fighter. 28 kills adorned his record, each one meticulously confirmed and celebrated with the customary schnapps. They say it has range, but what good is reaching Berlin if you're too slow to fight when you get there, he remarked, generating another round of laughter that echoed against the concrete walls. The morning light, pale and tentative, cast long shadows across the table as the pilots plotted their interception points, confidence evident in every casual gesture and offhand remark. Wilhelm Schmidt, the youngest of the 3 aces but with an impressive 15 confirmed kills, ran a hand through his blonde hair and leaned back in his chair. "I encountered 2 last week," he said, his voice carrying the slight hoarseness that came from shouting commands in the thin, high-altitude air. "They turned away as soon as they saw us coming. No fight in them." The others nodded in appreciation of his experience, while outside, ground crews scurried around the Messerschmitt Bf-109s, checking fuel lines and ammunition feeds with practiced efficiency. The distant rumble of Allied bombers, still too far to see but always present in the war-torn skies, seemed to underscore their conversation. What none of them knew, as they finished their briefing and moved toward their waiting aircraft, was that across the Channel, in a rain-soaked airfield in southern England, Lieutenant James Howard was completing his own preparations. The farm boy from Nebraska had heard the rumors about German aces dismissing the capabilities of his P-51D Mustang, had seen the casualty reports, had attended too many empty chair funerals. His expression, as he pulled on his flight gloves and adjusted his oxygen mask, revealed nothing of his thoughts, but his eyes held the steady gaze of a man who had something to prove. The clouds above promised poor visibility, and the forecast called for scattered rain showers across the Channel, conditions that typically favored the defenders who knew the terrain. As engines roared to life across 2 enemy airfields, neither side could anticipate how this day would alter the narrative of air superiority over Europe. The German aces, climbing into their cockpits with the casual confidence of predators, could not know that their assumptions about American engineering and piloting skill were about to be violently rewritten in the cold skies above France. The wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of rain and aviation fuel, as the stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything the Luftwaffe thought they knew about their American adversaries. The Messerschmitt Bf-109s climbed through layered clouds, their engines cutting through the morning stillness with mechanical precision. Hauptmann Weber led the formation, his aircraft's distinctive profile slicing upward at a steep angle, leaving contrails that marked the German presence like territorial claims written across the sky. Radio chatter was minimal. These men had flown together long enough to communicate through position changes and wing tilts, a deadly ballet rehearsed over dozens of successful missions. The sun occasionally broke through the cloud cover, sending brief flashes of light across their canopies and temporarily illuminating the black crosses painted on their wings, symbols that had come to represent terror for Allied pilots facing their lethal efficiency. 20,000 feet above occupied France, the air grew thin and brutally cold, causing ice crystals to form along the edges of the cockpit glass. Otto Müller flexed his fingers inside his gloves, feeling the familiar tension that preceded combat. Below them, the patchwork landscape of fields and forests seemed peaceful, belying the war that scarred it. Villages appeared as clusters of tiny structures, smoke rising from chimneys in thin vertical lines until caught and dispersed by the wind. This was their territory, their hunting ground, where they had established a dominance so complete that many believed it unassailable. The confidence they carried wasn't merely bravado, it was built upon statistical realities. The Luftwaffe aces had more experience, flew aircraft they considered superior, and operated with the advantage of defending airspace they knew intimately. Wilhelm Schmidt, flying slightly behind and to the right of Weber, adjusted his oxygen flow and scanned the horizon with practiced efficiency. His eyes, constantly moving, searched for the telltale dots that would signal the approaching American bomber formation. The ritual was familiar. Find the lumbering B-17s and B-24s, attack with precision, and disperse before their escorts could mount an effective defense. The P-51 Mustangs they had encountered previously had proven disappointing adversaries, limited in maneuverability at high altitude and often forced to turn back due to fuel constraints, while the bombers pressed on toward their targets. The German pilots had developed a dismissive nickname for them, Luftpferde, air horses, suggesting they were beasts of burden rather than true fighters. Across the radio came Weber's voice, tense with anticipation. Bomber formation sighted, heading 090, Angels 25. The three aces adjusted their course, climbing slightly higher to position themselves for the optimal diving attack that had proven so effective against American bomber formations. The enormous aerial armadas sent by the Americans were impressive in scale, but predictable in their rigid formations and routes. Or so they had been until recent months, when something had begun to change in the equation of air combat over Europe. Reports had filtered back of more aggressive American fighter escorts, of Mustangs appearing where they shouldn't have had the fuel to operate, of bombers reaching targets with fewer losses. The distant specks on the horizon gradually resolved into the distinctive silhouettes of B-17 flying fortresses, their formation tight and disciplined, sunlight occasionally glinting off their aluminum skins and turret guns. But it was the smaller, faster shapes moving around them that caused Weber to narrow his eyes and reassess his approach. P-51 Mustangs, more of them than expected, maintained a protective screen around the bomber formation. Through his gun sight, Weber counted at least 12 of the American fighters, their distinctive airframes unmistakable even at this distance. The wind had picked up, creating turbulence that rocked his Messerschmitt slightly as he transmitted new instructions to his wingmen. What happened next would later be pieced together from combat reports, gun camera footage, and the accounts of survivors. The German aces, still confident in their superior tactics and aircraft performance, began their attack run on the bomber formation. They could not know that among the P-51 pilots was Lieutenant James Howard, who had studied Luftwaffe tactics obsessively and waited for precisely this moment. As the German fighters dove toward their prey, Howard broke formation in a maneuver that seemed either foolhardy or brilliant, depending on one's perspective. His Mustang banked sharply, engine screaming as he pushed it to full power, moving to intercept the interceptors with a precision that would soon transform the mockery of German aces into stunned disbelief. The first indication that this engagement would be different came when Schmidt's Messerschmitt shuddered violently, struck by 50 caliber rounds that seemed to materialize from nowhere. He banked hard right, breaking off his attack run on the bombers, scanning frantically for the source of fire. Through his canopy, he glimpsed a P-51 Mustang pulling up in a tight vertical climb that his intelligence briefings had insisted the American aircraft couldn't perform at this altitude. The cold air in his cockpit suddenly felt insufficient as his pulse quickened and sweat formed beneath his flight suit despite the freezing temperatures. The sun caught the Mustang's canopy as it leveled out, momentarily blinding Schmidt as he tried to track its position against the glare. "Achtung! Mustang at your 6, Weber!" Schmidt shouted into his oxygen mask, the radio crackling with his warning. He watched as the Mustang, its olive-drab paint scheme making it difficult to track against the cloud backdrop, executed a rolling scissors maneuver to position itself behind Weber's aircraft. The German ace, with his 37 kills, responded with the confidence of experience, pulling his Bf 109 into a tight diving turn that had shaken countless Allied pursuers in previous engagements. But the Mustang followed, matching the German aircraft's descent rate and turn radius in a display of aerobatic precision that contradicted everything the Luftwaffe pilots had been told about American fighters and their pilots. The aerial ballet continued for precious seconds that stretched into eternity for the combatants. Müller, seeing his flight leader in trouble, abandoned his own attack run and maneuvered to engage the persistent Mustang. The sky around them had become a theater of war, with bomber gunners firing defensive patterns, other fighters locked in their own deadly dances, and contrails crisscrossing the blue expanse like chalk marks on a celestial blackboard. Below, French villagers emerged from their homes, faces turned upward at the sound of combat, watching tiny specks circle and dive with the knowledge that each maneuver represented life or death for the men strapped into the metal coffins above. Lieutenant Howard, alone in his cockpit, entered a state of heightened awareness that combat pilots describe as transcendent, where time slows, movements become instinctual, and the aircraft feels like an extension of the body rather than a machine to be operated. His P-51's Merlin engine roared steadily, the slight vibration through the control stick familiar and reassuring as he tracked Weber's Messerschmitt through his gun sight. Unlike the German aces who had dismissed his aircraft as inferior, Howard had spent countless hours understanding its capabilities, pushing its limits in training flights, and developing tactics that played to its strengths. Now, as he squeezed the trigger again, sending another burst toward the evading German fighter, he was implementing everything he had learned. The devastating rattle of heavy machine guns echoed through Weber's cockpit as Howard's rounds found their mark, tearing through the Messerschmitt's right wing and engine cowling. Black smoke began streaming from the German aircraft, initially thin but quickly thickening as damage to the cooling system caused engine temperatures to spike beyond sustainable levels. Weber, realizing his aircraft was mortally wounded, banked away from the engagement zone, hoping to reach friendly territory before being forced to abandon his stricken fighter. The smoke from his aircraft formed a dark calligraphic line against the sky, marking his retreat for all to witness, including his fellow aces who had never seen their leader driven from combat so decisively. Schmidt and Müller, witnessing Weber's defeat, abandoned their individual attacks on the bomber formation and turned to engage the lone Mustang that had disrupted their carefully planned interception. They approached from different angles, attempting to trap the American fighter in a crossfire that had proven effective against less experienced pilots. What they couldn't know was that Howard had anticipated this standard Luftwaffe tactic. As the two Messerschmitts converged on his position, he executed a maneuver that would later be studied in flight schools on both sides of the conflict. A vertical displacement roll that caused both German pilots to overshoot their target, momentarily finding themselves in the vulnerable position of flying across his line of fire rather than engaging from advantage points. The tables had turned so completely that the hunters now found themselves hunted by prey they had dismissed as unworthy of serious consideration. Otto Müller felt his confidence fracture like thin ice as the Mustang appeared in his rearview mirror, seemingly materialized from nowhere after that impossible vertical maneuver. His hands, steady through dozens of previous engagements, trembled slightly as he pushed his control stick forward and left, attempting a negative G dive that had saved him twice before when pursued by Spitfires. The G-forces pressed him against his harness, blood rushing to his head as the horizon spun in his vision. Fields and roads blurred below as he descended rapidly, expecting at any moment to feel the impact of 50 caliber rounds tearing through his aircraft's aluminum skin. The bitter taste of fear, unfamiliar and unwelcome, filled his mouth as sweat stung his eyes. The Mustang followed his dive with a precision that seemed almost personal, as if the American pilot could anticipate his thoughts rather than merely react to his maneuvers. Müller's Messerschmitt, renowned for its diving capabilities, should have pulled away from the pursuit. Instead, the distance between hunter and hunted remained constant, the American fighter matching his descent rate while gradually adjusting position for a killing shot. Through breaks in the clouds, French farmers looked up to see two aircraft locked in their deadly dance, one trailing the other with methodical determination. The wind across the fields below carried the echoing thunder of their engines to villages miles away, where children paused their play and adults crossed themselves in silent prayer. Schmidt, watching his comrade's plight from 500 meters away, pushed his own aircraft into a steep dive to intervene. His mind raced through tactical options, discarding each as quickly as it formed. The Mustang pilot was demonstrating skill and aircraft performance that contradicted everything they had been briefed to expect. The American fighter's turning radius, climb rate, and diving speed matched or exceeded the Messerschmitt's capabilities, advantages the Germans had relied upon for their survival and success. Now, as he struggled to line up a shot on the Mustang without endangering Müller, Schmidt felt the cold certainty that they had gravely miscalculated their opponent. The radio crackled with Müller's strained voice. "I cannot shake him. Engine overheating from sustained dive." The desperation in those words cut through the static, conveying the unthinkable, that an ace with 28 kills was facing defeat at the hands of an American pilot in an aircraft they had openly mocked. Howard, hearing none of this transmission but reading the situation clearly through the German aircraft's desperate maneuvers, maintained his pursuit with the patience of a predator. He had trained for this moment, had visualized it during long nights in the barracks, had absorbed every lesson from pilots who hadn't returned from previous missions. When Müller's Messerschmitt finally leveled off, engine coughing black smoke from the stress of the extended dive, Howard's response was immediate and devastating. The chattering roar of 650 caliber machine guns broke the momentary silence as Howard squeezed his trigger, sending a converging stream of tracers into the Messerschmitt's fuselage. Müller felt his aircraft lurch as rounds penetrated the engine compartment, severing oil lines and riddling the coolant system. The temperature gauge on his instrument panel jumped into the red zone as warning lights illuminated in rapid succession. The stick grew heavy in his hands as hydraulic pressure dropped, and the acrid smell of burning oil filled his cockpit. Through his canopy, he could see his right wing had caught fire, flames licking backward in the airstream, consuming the distinctive Luftwaffe markings that had once been a source of pride. Schmidt watched in horror as Müller's aircraft transformed into a falling comet, trailing fire and black smoke against the cold blue sky. He saw the canopy separate from the fuselage and Miller's parachute blossom seconds later, a small mercy in the brutality of aerial combat. But there was no time for relief, as the Mustang that had claimed his comrade's aircraft was already turning toward him, the sun glinting off its canopy like a predator's eye. In that moment, as he prepared to engage the American fighter that had already claimed two of Germany's decorated aces, Schmidt confronted a truth that would soon reshape the air war over Europe. The days of Luftwaffe dominance were ending, brought to a close by American engineering and pilots like Lieutenant Howard, who had transformed the P-51 Mustang from an object of derision into an instrument of retribution. The bitter wind carried away the smoke from Müller's fallen aircraft, dispersing it across the countryside below, where it would eventually settle like a funeral shroud over the fields of occupied France. Wilhelm Schmidt, last of the three German aces still airborne, faced a decision that would define the remainder of his combat career. His fuel gauge showed less than 15 minutes of flight time remaining after the extended engagement, barely enough to return to base if he disengaged immediately. The bombers he had been tasked with intercepting continued their inexorable progress toward their target, now protected by the remaining P-51 escorts who had reformed their defensive screen during the distraction provided by Howard's solo engagement. The rational choice was clear: retreat, preserve his aircraft and his life, report on the unexpected capabilities of both the American fighter and its pilot. Yet pride and training warred with reason as he banked his Messerschmitt toward the lone Mustang that had systematically dismantled the Luftwaffe's aura of invincibility. Lieutenant Howard, seeing the approaching German fighter, felt a momentary surge of respect for his opponent's courage even as he prepared for the final engagement. His own ammunition counters showed less than half his original load remaining, each .50 caliber round now precious and not to be wasted on speculative long-range shots. The two aircraft circled each other warily, altitude gradually decreasing as both pilots maneuvered for position, leaving spiral contrails that observers on the ground would later describe as a strange aerial script, as if the combatants were writing their own story across the sky. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape below, the day's light beginning its retreat as the two fighters continued their deadly negotiation of space and advantage. The final engagement began with Schmidt attempting a head-on attack, a high-risk maneuver that relied on superior German gun sights and the heavier caliber of the Messerschmitt's cannon compared to the Mustang's machine guns. Howard, recognizing the tactic, held his course for a critical second longer than safety dictated, before executing a quarter roll that caused Schmidt's cannon rounds to pass harmlessly above his cockpit. The German ace, committed to his attack run, flashed past the American fighter with barely 10 meters of separation, close enough for both pilots to glimpse each other's faces through their canopies in a moment of strangely intimate connection amidst the chaos of combat. In that fraction of a second, Schmidt saw not the inferior opponent he had expected, but a determined equal whose eyes reflected the same professional calculation as his own. The Messerschmitt's superior turning ability should have given Schmidt the advantage, as he pulled hard into a climbing right turn, intending to loop around onto the Mustang's tail. Howard, anticipating the standard Luftwaffe tactic, countered with a maneuver that exploited the P-51's less publicized strengths, a climbing spiral that traded airspeed for altitude while maintaining a defensive position. The two aircraft ascended in a tightening corkscrew, engines straining against gravity and the demands of their pilots. Below them, the bomber formation continued eastward, now almost beyond visual range, their mission proceeding while this personal duel played out in isolation from the larger strategic conflict that had necessitated it. Schmidt, finding himself unable to gain the positional advantage he needed, despite executing textbook maneuvers, made a critical error born of frustration and dwindling fuel reserves. He attempted to cut inside Howard's turning radius with a sudden reduction in airspeed, a maneuver that had worked countless times against Spitfires and earlier American fighters. But the Mustang's handling characteristics at low speed were unlike anything the German pilots had encountered before, allowing Howard to maintain control and positioning even as Schmidt's aircraft approached the dangerous edge of a stall. The moment of vulnerability was brief but decisive, providing Howard with the shooting opportunity he had patiently created through minutes of tactical maneuvering. The final burst from the Mustang's 6 machine guns caught Schmidt's Messerschmitt at its most vulnerable point, the junction where the right wing met the fuselage, where fuel lines and control cables clustered in a space smaller than a man's fist. Metal fragments tore through this critical area, severing hydraulic lines and igniting fuel that sprayed into the superheated air around the engine cowling. Schmidt felt the aircraft shudder beneath him as control surfaces failed to respond to his inputs, the stick suddenly loose in his hand like a marionette with cut strings. Through his canopy, he saw pieces of his aircraft's skin peeling away, revealing the structural framework beneath like an anatomy lesson performed at 18,000 feet. The roar of wind replaced the familiar engine note as his instrument panel went dark, electrical systems failing in cascading sequence. As Schmidt reached for his canopy release, preparing to abandon his mortally wounded aircraft, he looked up one final time to see the P-51 Mustang circling above him, not to confirm the kill or press the attack, but in what he would later describe in his debriefing as a gesture of respect between warriors. Howard waggled his wings in the universal pilot's salute before turning away, his mission accomplished, his fuel reserves now critical for the long journey home. Schmidt's parachute deployed successfully moments later, carrying him gently toward the fields below, where French resistance members would find him before the German recovery teams could arrive. As he descended through the cold afternoon air, watching his Messerschmitt impact the ground in a final eruption of flame and black smoke, Wilhelm Schmidt confronted the truth that would soon reach every Luftwaffe base across occupied Europe. The era of German air superiority had ended not with a grand defeat, but with the quiet revelation that an American farm boy from Nebraska, flying an aircraft they had laughed at during their morning briefing, had forever changed the equation of aerial warfare over the continent.